Steady now. We need a clean draw from this point.
Holding steady, Doctor. The flow is consistent.
In the heart of the Victorian era, a time of strict morals, prudish manners, and deep ignorance about women's bodies, a strange medical revolution was taking place behind closed doors. Doctors, in their somber black coats and solemn faces, claimed to treat an epidemic they called female hysteria. Its symptoms were said to include anxiety, irritability, fainting, sexual frustration, and even disobedience. The cure, however, was unlike anything in modern medicine. It involved doctors performing what they called pelvic massages, manually stimulating their female patients until they experienced what was then termed a paroxysm, the medical euphemism for orgasm. To the Victorians, this was not a sexual act but a legitimate medical treatment. Yet beneath this facade of science lay a deep misunderstanding and a fascinating contradiction about women, desire, and control. What society couldn't accept as pleasure, it disguised as medicine, and in doing so, it unknowingly created one of history's strangest inventions, the vibrator. This is the story of how prudish doctors, in their effort to suppress female sexuality, accidentally ignited a quiet revolution of pleasure, a revolution hidden in plain sight. The 19th century was an age of progress and paradox. While steam engines roared, telegraphs clicked, and cities rose with industrial might, the inner lives of women were confined within rigid expectations. The ideal Victorian woman was delicate, obedient, and pure, a symbol of domestic virtue. Yet, as society changed rapidly, so did the pressures on women, and doctors began to claim that this strain was making them ill. They called it hysteria, a word derived from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus. The name itself betrayed its bias. Hysteria was believed to be a disease born from the womb, proof, in their eyes, that women were slaves to their biology. Any woman who displayed sadness, frustration, or even sexual desire could be labeled hysterical. The symptoms list was endless: anxiety, fainting spells, insomnia, irritability, depression, loss of appetite, or simply a lack of enthusiasm for domestic life. For many women, hysteria became a cruel label, a way for men to medicalize female emotion and independence. Husbands brought their wives to doctors complaining of nerves or fits, and physicians responded with solemn authority. They diagnosed, prescribed, and treated, but rarely listened. The medical community, lacking any true understanding of female anatomy or psychology, genuinely believed they were combating a physiological condition. Influential figures like Jean-Martin Charcot and Sigmund Freud would later study hysteria in different ways, but in its Victorian context, the diagnosis served a more social function. It reinforced control. Women were told their suffering came from their wombs, from their natural instability, and thus from themselves. Yet, while hysteria was rooted in superstition, it was also profitable. By the late 1800s, the condition became one of the most common diagnoses in Europe and America. Medical journals were filled with case studies, doctors advertised their services, and women from all social classes visited clinics seeking relief from mysterious ailments. The industry around female hysteria grew so large that it became an accepted part of medical practice and a steady source of income for physicians. Behind the polished doors of these respectable practices, however, something extraordinary was happening. Treatments varied, from leeches and cold baths to smelling salts, but one stood out for its effectiveness. Doctors noticed that when they performed a certain manual stimulation of the pelvic area, their patients would often experience sudden emotional release, followed by a deep sense of calm. They called this a hysterical paroxysm. Today, we call it an orgasm. At the time, this explanation seemed perfectly scientific. Doctors didn't connect it to sexual pleasure. They viewed it as the body expelling excess female energy. It was a way to restore the patient's balance, relieve her nervous tension, and send her home feeling better. Ironically, many patients eagerly returned for repeated treatments, not because they believed in the cure, but because, for the first time, Something made them feel alive. Thus began one of the strangest chapters in medical history, when the suppression of female desire led to its very discovery. In trying to silence women's emotions, Victorian doctors stumbled upon the truth they refused to acknowledge, that the problem wasn't hysteria at all. It was the world that denied women their right to feel. As the 19th century progressed, female hysteria became not just a diagnosis, but a full-blown medical industry. Across Europe and America, clinics specialized in treating women afflicted by this so-called epidemic of nerves. Middle-class women, often overworked and emotionally neglected, lined up in doctors' waiting rooms seeking relief from their restlessness, melancholy, and anxiety. The male physicians, armed with little more than superstition and authority, believed they were performing a noble duty, purging women of an illness that, in their minds, originated from sexual deprivation and uterine disorder. The cure they offered was shockingly intimate. It was called pelvic massage, a clinical term for manually stimulating the patient's genitals until she reached what was politely described as a hysterical paroxysm. The paroxysm, an orgasm in everything but name, was considered a medical event, not a sexual one. Doctors insisted there was no sensuality involved. It was purely mechanical, a way to release pent-up fluids and restore balance to the womb. This treatment became astonishingly common. Historical records suggest that by the mid-1800s, a large percentage of women were diagnosed with hysteria at least once in their lives. Physicians often reported their offices filled with fainting couches, screens for privacy, and patients who returned weekly for their therapy. To the modern mind, it seems absurd, even scandalous. But in the prudish morality of Victorian society, where female sexuality was never spoken of, this bizarre ritual managed to exist openly under the banner of medicine. The process itself was described in remarkable detail by medical writers of the time. One English physician, Dr. George Taylor, wrote about how he used various oils and mechanical aids to achieve therapeutic results. Others confessed the treatment was tiring and time-consuming, requiring considerable effort from the practitioner. Some doctors, complaining of hand cramps and fatigue, even wrote letters to medical journals about the physical strain caused by these sessions. They weren't being ironic, they truly saw this as exhausting medical labor. Yet their female patients often left these appointments transformed, smiling, relaxed, and visibly lighter. For many, this was the only socially acceptable context in which they could experience sexual release, though no one dared call it that. Married women whose husbands were emotionally distant, widows, or those trapped in loveless unions found in their doctor's office a strange sanctuary, a place where their suppressed emotions and repressed bodies could momentarily come alive. Of course, not all women accepted this practice passively. Some began to sense that there was more to this cure than science admitted. Diaries and letters from the late Victorian era hint that women were aware, even amused, by the hypocrisy of it all. They understood that doctors were treating something that wasn't an illness at all, that what society labeled hysteria was often just desire, loneliness, or rebellion seeking expression. Still, the medical establishment refused to acknowledge any connection between the treatment and sexual pleasure. Victorian doctors prided themselves on being moral guardians. To them, sexuality, especially female sexuality, was dangerous, something that needed to be controlled or suppressed. Admitting that women could experience or even deserve pleasure was unthinkable, so the ritual continued, cloaked in medical jargon and moral righteousness. But as demand for this treatment grew, the system began to strain. Doctors could no longer keep up with the sheer number of patients. A single session could take hours, and word of the miraculous cure spread quickly through polite society. Physicians began to look for ways to make the process faster, more efficient, and, crucially, less exhausting. This was not only about medicine, it was about business. The cure for hysteria was becoming a profitable enterprise. It was in this atmosphere of moral repression and commercial opportunity that innovation quietly crept in. medical inventors started experimenting with devices designed to produce the same therapeutic paroxysms with less manual labor. Steam-powered massage machines, water-powered contraptions, and even hand-cranked instruments began to appear in private clinics. These devices were marketed as medical tools for treating nervous disorders, muscle tension, and, discreetly, hysteria. One of the earliest known versions was developed in the 1880s, the electromechanical vibrator. What began as a doctor's tool for health restoration would soon escape the clinical world entirely and find its way into homes under the guise of personal wellness. But that transformation would come later. For now, in dimly lit consulting rooms across London, Paris, and New York, doctors continued their peculiar work, massaging away the demons of hysteria. By the late 19th century, the hysteria epidemic had reached astonishing proportions. Women from every social class, aristocrats, housewives, widows, even nuns, were being diagnosed and treated by their doctors in the name of science. For physicians, it became both a profitable and exhausting routine. The cure, once viewed as a mark of medical sophistication, began to feel more like physical labor than intellectual work. Doctors openly complained about the fatigue caused by this manual therapy. Medical journals of the time even described it as a tedious and time-consuming procedure that demanded skill, patience, and considerable effort. One doctor famously confessed that inducing hysterical paroxysms in patients could take more than an hour and sometimes required repeated attempts. The irony was clear. In an era obsessed with female modesty, hundreds of respectable physicians were spending their days performing what was, in essence, sexual stimulation. But in the midst of this strange profession, innovation was brewing. The Industrial Revolution had already transformed every corner of Victorian life. Machines were replacing manual labor in factories, farms, and homes. So why not in medicine? If machines could spin cotton and pump steam, surely they could assist in producing the necessary paroxysm more efficiently. Thus began one of the most curious moments in medical history, the mechanization of female pleasure. The first attempts were crude. Some doctors used hydrotherapy, directing powerful streams of water at the patient's pelvis to achieve the desired effect. Others experimented with vibrating chairs, rocking tables, or rotating brushes powered by foot pedals or water pressure. These devices were marketed in medical catalogs as tools for improving circulation, restoring vitality, and treating hysteria. The descriptions were clinical and vague, but their purpose was unmistakable. Then came a pivotal invention that changed everything. In 1880, Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville, a British physician, patented the first electromechanical vibrator, the percuteur. Granville, ironically, didn't design it for treating women at all. He created it for massaging male muscles and relieving pain. But other doctors quickly realized that his invention could serve another, far more lucrative purpose. The vibrator could achieve the same therapeutic paroxysm faster, more efficiently, and without the exhaustion that manual therapy required. Soon, electric vibrators became the new craze in medical practice. Doctors embraced the devices enthusiastically, boasting that they could now treat more patients in less time. Women, meanwhile, praised the miraculous results, often describing themselves as renewed, lighter, and free from nervous strain. The treatment had never been so accessible, or so mechanical. By the 1890s, the vibrator had evolved into smaller, handheld models. Advertisements appeared in medical journals and even household catalogs, offering them for personal use. They were sold under names like the American Vibratory, Dr. Swift's Health Restorer, and the Chattanooga. Their packaging promised instant relief from female weakness, fatigue, and hysteria. None mentioned the word orgasm, of course. That was a truth too scandalous to speak aloud. Yet despite the silence, society began to sense something peculiar. Women were purchasing vibrators for home use, sometimes without a doctor's supervision. These devices were sold alongside hairbrushes and sewing machines, common household tools, hiding their true purpose in plain sight. Victorian propriety could only turn a blind eye for so long. Behind the polite smiles and lace curtains, something revolutionary was happening. Women were beginning to explore their own bodies, privately, safely, and without shame. What began as a clinical prescription was turning into an awakening. For the first time in modern history, women had access to a device that could bring them pleasure without judgment, fear, or dependence on a man. It was a quiet rebellion disguised as self-care. Meanwhile, the medical community continued to pretend that nothing unusual was occurring. Doctors still insisted the vibrator was purely therapeutic, a tool to treat nervous exhaustion. But their tone began to shift. Some medical journals started expressing discomfort with how popular these devices had become, especially among unmarried women. Questions arose. Was hysteria truly a disease? Or was it simply an excuse for something deeper, something society didn't want to confront? By the early 1900s, the truth was becoming harder to deny. The vibrator had entered the world of consumer goods, and with it came curiosity, satire, and scandal. The first motion pictures and burlesque shows began to hint at its true use, and by the 1920s, the vibrator disappeared from respectable advertising altogether. What had started as a medical breakthrough became, overnight. By the dawn of the 20th century, a quiet revolution was taking shape in the privacy of Victorian bedrooms. The hysteria epidemic that had once kept women under medical supervision was fading, but something else had begun, something the doctors never intended. The vibrator, born in the stiff, sterile world of medicine, had escaped into the hands of the very women it was meant to cure. What had been sold as therapy became, for countless women, the first taste of liberation, a secret rebellion wrapped in the guise of respectability. To understand this transformation, we must look at the world these women lived in. Victorian and Edwardian society was one of contradictions. Outwardly moralistic, yet silently obsessed with control and repression. Women were raised to believe that modesty was their virtue, obedience their duty, and silence their strength. Even in marriage, they were expected to endure intimacy as a conjugal responsibility, not as a shared pleasure. The mere idea that a woman might seek satisfaction was seen as improper, even immoral, and yet through the very tool invented to suppress them, women began to reclaim something long denied, ownership of their bodies. When the vibrator became available for home use, it offered privacy, discretion, and safety. Three things society had never allowed women to have in relation to their desires. No doctors, no judgment, just the promise of relief from nerves, restoration of balance, or female wellness. The language was coded, but the experience was real. The early advertisements were masterclasses in double meaning. "Bring life and vigor back to tired nerves," one read. "A scientific marvel for ladies' health and beauty," promised another. The images showed serene women resting, eyes closed, hands delicately holding the device, not as an erotic object, but as a symbol of refined self-care. Behind this innocent facade, however, lay something profoundly subversive. For the first time, women were quietly rewriting the rules of their own pleasure. For many, the experience was transformative. Letters and private diaries from the era reveal that women often described feeling whole, revived, or newly awakened after using these devices. They didn't have the vocabulary to speak of sexual fulfillment. Society had not yet given them that language. But their words were filled with an unmistakable sense of discovery. What they were uncovering was not illness, but the humanity their culture had denied them. This private revolution spread in silence, carried by gossip, advertisements, and word of mouth. Upper-class women bought them through catalogs, while middle-class wives might save money to buy one from a discreet pharmacy. Some even shared them among friends under the guise of wellness instruments. Each transaction, each moment of hidden use, was an act of quiet defiance. Ironically, this liberation grew from the very institutions that had once imprisoned women's bodies. The medical world, in denying female sexuality, had unwittingly provided the tools for its awakening. The vibrator, originally designed to suppress passion, now fueled it. Doctors may have claimed to heal hysteria, but their patients were healing something far deeper, the wound of repression itself. Outside these private rebellions, society remained blind. The same newspapers that printed vibrator advertisements would also publish sermons on purity and the dangers of female independence. The contradiction was staggering, and yet it persisted, as all hypocrisies do, until exposure became inevitable. By the early 1900s, the truth began to leak into popular culture. Vaudeville skits and early silent films began to make sly jokes about electrical health devices. The more the public laughed, the more embarrassed the medical community became. Doctors distanced themselves from the treatment that had once filled their offices. The vibrator, once a tool of science, was now branded indecent. But even as society tried to bury the truth, women refused to let it die. The secret had already done its work. It had shown them that pleasure was not a symptom of disease. It was a sign of life. The vibrator became more than an object. It became a symbol of ownership, a small but powerful step toward bodily autonomy. In this sense, the sexual awakening of women did not begin with open protest or public speeches. It began in whispers, in locked rooms, in moments stolen from a world that forbade them joy. The revolution did not march through the streets. It hummed quietly in the dark. The legacy of that hidden rebellion would echo far beyond the Victorian age. The women who dared to seek treatment became, unknowingly, the pioneers of modern sexual freedom. Their private acts of defiance laid the foundation for future movements, for the right to speak of pleasure, to demand equality, to live as full, feeling human beings.